17th, about noon, the emperor sent for me. His breakfast was just over. He was no better than he had been yesterday. He endeavored to converse a little, and then read in English a few pages of The Vicar of Wakefield. He still complained of drowsiness, and after several vain efforts to rouse himself, he retired to his chamber to try and take a nap. He was the more astonished that this heaviness should continue, as he said he had slept well during the night. He did not leave his chamber until dinner was ready, and after dinner he tried to read a little Don Quixote, but he almost immediately laid down the book and retired. As it was very early, he sent for me after he had gone to bed, and I remained with him nearly an hour conversing on different subjects. We spoke of Louis XVI, the Queen, Madame Elizabeth, their martyrdom. He asked me to tell him what I knew of the king and queen and what they had said to me on my presentation. The forms and ceremonies of the court were, I informed him, the same as those which were adopted during the empire. As to character, I observed it was generally admitted that the queen had disappointed public expectation. During the first moments of the revolutionary storm, there was every reason to suppose her a woman of great talent and energy, but subsequently these qualities seemed entirely to forsake her. With regard to the king, I mentioned the opinion formed of him by Monsieur Bertrand de Molleville, with whom I had been well acquainted and who was Minister of Marine to Louis XVI at the height of the crisis. He pronounced the king to have possessed considerable information, sound judgment, and excellent intentions, but there it all ended. He lost himself by the multiplicity of advice which he solicited, and by his irresolute and wavering mode of following that advice. The emperor in his turn retraced the portrait of the queen by Madame Campan, who, he observed, having been her confidant, and having served her with zeal, affection, and fidelity, might be expected to have known a great deal about her, and deserved to be considered as a good authority. Madame Campan, he said, had communicated to him many details of the private life of the queen, and he related some particulars which he had derived from that source. The queen, according to Madame Campan, was a fascinating woman, but destitute of talent. She was better calculated to be a votary of pleasure than a participator in affairs of state. She possessed an excellent heart, was parsimonious rather than extravagant, and by no means possessed strength of character equal to the trying circumstances in which she was placed. She obtained regular information of the schemes that were carrying on abroad, and she never entertained a doubt of her deliverance, even up to the fatal 10th of August, the catastrophe of which was brought about solely by the intrigues and hopes of the court, which were developed to the world through the imprudence of the king and those who surrounded him. On the terrible night of the 5th of October, said the emperor, a person for whom the queen entertained a high regard, and whom I afterwards treated very ill at Restadt, hastened to join the princess at Versailles. Whether he had been sent for or whether he was sent of his own accord to share her dangers, I know not. It is in these trying moments, continued the emperor, that we feel most in need of the advice and consolation of those who are devoted to us. At the moment of the catastrophe, when the palace was forced, the queen fled for refuge to the king's apartments, but her confidant was exposed to the greatest dangers and only escaped by leaping out a window. I informed the emperor that the queen had greatly fallen in the estimation of the emigrants by her conduct during the events of Varennes. She was reproached for not having allowed the king to set out alone, and for having betrayed a want of skill and energy during the flight of the royal family. Nothing indeed could be more ill-managed and confused than the journey to Varennes. A curious circumstance connected with that event was that Leonard, the queen's famous coiffeur, found means to pass in his cabriolet through the midst of the tumult, and he arrived at Coblentz, bringing with him the marshal's baton, which it was said the king had carried away from the Tuileries in order to deliver it to Mr. de Bouillé when he should join him. It was, said the emperor, an established rule with the members of the House of Austria to observe profound silence respecting the Queen of France. Whenever the name Marie Antoinette was mentioned, they cast down their eyes and dexterously changed the conversation as if to avoid a disagreeable and embarrassing subject. This rule, continued the emperor, was adopted by all the members of the family and recommended to their agents abroad. The efforts lately made by the French princes in Paris to revive the interest attached to the memory of the unfortunate queen must certainly have been displeasing to the court of Vienna. The emperor next asked me some questions concerning the Princess de Lamballe, of whom he said he knew nothing. I was unable to answer his questions, as I had known the princess well. One of my cousins had been her lady of honor, and on my arrival at Aix-la-Chapelle at the commencement of my emigration, I was received as one of her household and treated with the utmost kindness. At Aix-la-Chapelle, the Princess de Lamballe had assembled around her many of the wrecks of Versailles. He was surrounded by nobles and persons of fashion who had been connected with the old court. She was also visited by many illustrious foreigners, and while I remained with her, I frequently saw Gustavus III, King of Sweden, who went by the name of the Count de Haga, Prince Ferdinand of Prussia, and his children, the eldest of whom, Prince Louis, was killed just before the Battle of Vienna, the Duchess of Cumberland, the widow of a brother of the King of England, when Louis XVI solidly accepted the Constitution and thus recomposed the nation. The princess received an official letter from the Queen inviting her to return to her situation. She consulted her old friends, who declared themselves of opinion that the Queen was not free, and conceiving that there would be no safety in Paris, they advised her to take no notice of the Queen's letter and to let it be supposed it had never come to hand. The princess, however, having asked some other individuals how they would advise her to act, they unfortunately replied, "Madame, you shared the prosperity of the Queen, and you have now a noble opportunity of proving your fidelity, particularly since you are no longer her favorite." The princess possessed lofty sentiments, warm affections, and was rather of a romantic turn of mind. She declared her intention of setting out next day for Paris. The unfortunate lady therefore returned to the capital with the full knowledge of the danger to which she was exposed, and she fell the victim of generosity and noble sentiment. When the princess determined on proceeding to Paris, my friends proposed that I should accompany her as one of her suite. My youth, together with the circumstance of my being almost a stranger in Paris, would have enabled me to pass unnoticed, and I might perhaps have been serviceable to her, but at the moment of her departure some difficulty arose which prevented me from accompanying her. However, I became her correspondent, and every other day I transmitted to her the histories and absurd stories of every kind, which served to feed our hopes and to which we failed not to give implicit credit. I continued my correspondence while we remained in the country. I even continued it after she had ceased to exist. The extreme affliction in which I was plunged on hearing of her dreadful fate was occasionally augmented by the fear that my letters might perhaps have had some share in producing it. I happen to have now in my possession some lines which she wrote a few days before the horrible catastrophe which closed her existence. They are dated from my dungeon, for so she called the pavilion of Flora, which she at that time occupied in the Tuileries. The 18th. I did not see the emperor until 5 o'clock, when he sent for me to attend him in the drawing room. He continued indisposed, but he had, notwithstanding, been engaged all the morning in dictating to the Grand Marshal. He summoned all the individuals of his suite in succession. He was low-spirited and heavy, but at the same time there was a certain restlessness about him. He sought to amuse himself in various ways. He first tried chess, then dominoes, and then chess again. But he was at length compelled to return to his chamber, finding it impossible to sit up. The state of the weather, joined to the vexations to which we are exposed, concur in producing torments almost beyond endurance. The weather has an effect on the nerves, and the persecutions that are heaped upon us are still worse to bear. Every word uttered by the governor increases our misery. Today, he has signified his intention of removing 4 of our establishment, which has been the cause of general lamentation among the household. The individuals singled out for removal regret their separation from their companions, while those who are to remain are tormented by the fear of speedily sharing the same fate. We compared Sir Hudson Lowe to Scylla, devouring the 4 companions of Ulysses. The governor has informed me that he also intends removing my servant, who is an inhabitant of the island, and with whom I am very well satisfied. He is doubtless afraid that the man would become too much attached to me. He proposes to send me a servant of his own choosing, a favor for which I feel very grateful, though I have no intention of availing myself of that kind offer. Dinner. The emperor ate but little. During the dessert, however, his spirits revived a little, and we began to converse on the events of his early life. This is a subject in which he delights to dwell, and which always affords him a source of new and lively interest. He repeated many of the particulars which I have already related at different times. He said he loved to carry himself back to that happy age when all is gaiety and enjoyment, that happy period of hope and rising ambition, when the world first opens before us and the mind finally cherishes every romantic dream. He spoke of his regiment and the pleasures he had enjoyed when he first mingled in society. On mentioning the different balls and fetes which he had attended in his youthful days, he described one as having been particularly splendid. But, said he, at that time my notions of splendor were very different from what they are now. Alluding to the date of certain circumstances, he observed that it would be difficult for him to detail his life year by year. We observed that if he would only date the events of 4 or 5 years, we could easily take all the rest upon ourselves. He reverted to his debut at the military school of Toulon. The circumstances that first called him into notice, the sudden ascendancy which he acquired by his first successes, and the ambition with which they inspired in him. And yet, said he, I was far from entertaining a high opinion of myself. It was not till after the battle of Lodi that I conceived those lofty notions of ambition which were confirmed in Egypt after the victory of the pyramids and the possession of Cairo. Then, said he, I willingly resigned myself to every brilliant dream. The emperor had become very cheerful and talkative, and he did not retire until midnight. We looked upon this as a sort of resuscitation. The 19th. Our 4 outlaws, namely the Pole, Santini, Archambault, and Rousseau, left us about the middle of the day. And after an hour, they sailed for the Cape with a brisk wind. About 3 o'clock, the emperor sent for me. He was in the drawing room, and he desired to have Madame de Staël's novels brought to him. He read a few pages aloud, but he soon laid down the books, observing that they told him nothing. It was not so with me. The few pages that I had just heard touched many tender strings. They presented a picture of the elegant society of Paris, detailed the names of streets and monuments, described familiar conversations, and retraced well-known portraits. All this produced a forcible impression on me. Their realities exist, and myself exist, and yet we were separated by distance, time, and doubtless by eternity. I could at this moment look with indifference on pleasure and gaiety, but the recollection of persons and places which had thus been revived filled me with feelings of deep melancholy and regret. The Grand Marshal now arrived, and the Emperor dictated to him till dinner time. In the evening, the Emperor asked for the Arabian Nights, but he was unable to read, and soon laid aside the book. The 20th. I spent the day in estimating the value of the books sent to us from London, and for which an enormous sum is claimed of the Emperor. Our valuation did not amount to even half that sum. The Emperor did not appear in the drawing room until a moment before dinner. He had not, he said, seen anybody the whole day. He had sought for diversion and found it in continued application. After dinner, he again took up the Arabian Nights. The Grand Marshal and his family have this day left Huts Gate, their first residence, which was situated about 1 league from Longwood. They have at last taken possession of their new house, by which means we are now nearly under the same roof. This is quite an event for them and for us. The 21st. I went after breakfast to see Madame Bertrand. She was so confined at Huts Gate that she will have no cause to regret being shut up within our enclosure, and we shall be very great gainers by it. For my part, it seemed to me as if I had found part of my family. Our limits become every day more circumscribed. The number of centuries is augmented. Everything reminds us incessantly of our horrible prison. The Emperor said to me whilst he was dressing that he was determined to apply once more regularly to his occupations, which had been interrupted by the late ill treatment from our horrible governor. I urged him to do so with all my might, as well for his own sake as for ours, and for France, and for history. The weather was too bad to allow the Emperor to take the air. He went into his library and looked over the history of the Crusades by Michaud and the Memoirs of Joinville. From thence he went to the drawing room and conversed for some time longer, particularly respecting the servant which they wished to take from me, and one they intend to give me. The governor will only give for the emperor's plate, a sum which is more than a fifth less than the plate is valued at in Paris, and yet he will neither allow any competition for the sale of it in the island, nor of its being taken to London. The unfortunate people that have been shipped for the Cape will be fed like common sailors. I have heard on this occasion that the same thing took place on board the Northumberland, and that the emperor's servants had not any indulgence more than the common sailors, except by paying for it. After dinner, the emperor read in Joinville an account of the expedition of St. Louis in Egypt. He analyzed it, pointing out its defects and comparing the movements and the plan of that expedition with the plan adopted by himself, concluding that if he had acted in the same manner as St. Louis had done, he would undoubtedly have shared the same fate. The emperor retired early and sent for me, and the conversation again fell upon his excursions in Egypt and in Syria. Matilda, a novel by Madame Cotin, the scene of which is laid in those countries, being incidentally mentioned, led the emperor to take a review of our female authors. He spoke of Madame Roland and her memoirs, of Madame de Staël, of Madame Cotin, who's Claire d'Alba, he had just been reading, and of Madame de Staël. He spoke at length about the latter, repeated in part what he has already said. Speaking of her exile, he said, "Her house had become quite an arsenal against me. People went there to be armed knights. She endeavored to raise enemies against me and fought against me herself. She was at once Armida and Clorinda." Then, summing up his arguments, as he was wont to do, he said, "After all, it cannot be denied that Madame de Staël is a very distinguished woman, endowed with great talents, and possessing a considerable share of wit. She will go down to posterity. It was more than once hinted to me, in order to soften me in her favor, that she was an adversary to be feared, and might become a useful ally, and certainly if instead of reviling me as she did, she had spoken in my praise, it might no doubt have proved advantageous to me, for her position. Her abilities gave her an absolute sway over the saloons, and their influence in Paris is well known." He then added, "Notwithstanding all that she has said against me, and all that she will say yet, I am certainly far from thinking or saying that she has a bad heart. The fact is that she and I have waged a little war against each other, that is all." Then, taking a review of the numerous writers who had declaimed against him, he said, "I am destined to be their food, but I have little fear of becoming their victim. They will bite against granite. My history is made up of facts, and words alone cannot destroy them. In order to fight against me successfully, somebody should appear in the lists armed with the weight and authority of facts on his side. If such a man as the great Frederick, or any other man of his caste, were to take to writing against me, then it would be a different thing. It would then perhaps be time for me to begin to be moved. But as for all other writers, whatever be their talent, their efforts will be vain. My fame will survive, and when they wish to be admired, they will sound my praise."